Good morning. This meeting will come to order. This is a public meeting of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to consider proposed rules under the Dodd-Frank Act. I'd like to welcome members of the public, market participants, and members of the media, as well as those listening on the phone lines and watching the webcast. I would like to thank my fellow commissioners, Commissioners Chilton, O'Malley, and Weegan for their significant contributions to the rule writing process, and thank this incredibly dedicated and hardworking staff. And I extend that thanks in the midst of some very unusual time for the CFTC, that we not only went through a 16-day government shutdown, and I thank so many of you that were either furloughed or back at work here, but then we're at an unusual time that we have, unfortunately, instituted administrative furloughs given our budget circumstances. So my deep appreciation for your dedication and efforts. Today we will consider two proposed rules on position limits. I support seeking public comment on each of these proposed rules. Now, the CFTC does not set or regulate prices. The Commission is charged with promoting the integrity of the futures and swaps markets. The Commission is charged with protecting both the public from fraud, manipulation, and other abuses. And since the Commodity Exchange Act passed in 1936, position limits have been a tool to curb or prevent excessive speculation that may burden interstate commerce. Those are the words of the statute from 1936. And for a fuller understanding of the long history of this commission and our predecessors on these matters, I'd actually like to include in the record and in the proposed rule preamble a reference to the excellent testimony of former General Counsel Dan Berkovitz from July of 2009, which was the first of 9 meetings of this commission on these matters. That testimony is called Position Limits and the Hedge Exemption, Brief Legislative History. Dan's concept of brief, it was 13 pages. But in the Dodd-Frank Act, Congress directed the Commission to impose limits on speculative positions in physical commodity futures and option contracts and economically equivalent swaps. And in 2011, the CFTC finalized a rule that addressed Congress's direction to prevent any single trader from obtaining too large a share of the market to ensure that the derivatives markets, futures and swaps, remain fair and competitive. Last fall, a federal district court vacated that rule. It is critically important, however, that those position limits, or these position limits, be established, as I believe Congress required. The agency has historically interpreted our obligations to promote market integrity to include ensuring that markets do not become too concentrated. When the CFTC set position limits in the past, and we've done so for, I guess, nearly 70-plus years, again, I direct you to Dan Berkovitz's long history of this. It sought to ensure that the markets were made up of a broad group of participants with no one speculator having an outsized position. Now, why is this? This promotes the integrity of the price discovery function in the market. How so? By limiting the size of any one speculator's footprint in that market. Secondly, I believe the position limits further protect the markets and the clearinghouses as well, as such limits diminish the possible burdens when any individual participant may need to sell or liquidate a position in times of individual stress. And we are a commission and an agency that part of our remit is to think about when individual institutions need to liquidate their positions in times of stress or default. And we also oversee clearinghouses in addition to overseeing the price discovery function. I think position limits have been part of this regime because they help protect burdens that can come from outsized positions for both the price discovery function as well as the clearinghouses. Thus, I believe position limits help to protect the markets both in times of clear skies, the price discovery function certainly, as well as when there's a storm on the horizon. Both clearinghouses and price discovery function, I think, are helped in those times through these means and methods that were laid out 7 to 8 decades ago by Congress. With a strong proposal ready for Commission consideration today, we determined that the best path forward to expedite position limits implementation was to pursue a new rule and dismiss the appeal of the District Court's ruling subject to the Commission's approval of this proposal today. This, I think, was a balanced decision, and like any decision, it was a matter of judgment, but I do believe that this is the best way to expedite position limit implementation. Today's proposed rule is consistent with congressional intent. The rule establishes federal position limits in 28 reference commodities and agriculture, energy, and metals markets as part of a phased approach, allowing the Commission time to look at other commodities moving forward. It would establish one position limits regime for the spot month and another for single month and all months combined limits, as no doubt the staff will walk us through. Spot month limits would be set for futures contracts that are being physically settled, as well as those swaps and futures that can only be cash settled. And we're seeking significant comment on alternatives on the approach from cash settled contracts, and no doubt we'll get a lot of comments on that one particular and important matter. Spot month limits are very critical, particularly as it relates to corners and squeezes and other manipulative acts in the marketplace, but also to ensure the price discovery function and the protection of clearinghouses. But there's another type of limit as well called single month and all month combined limits, which the Commission currently sets only for certain agricultural contracts, and we would, through these rules, be reestablishing these types of limits in the energy and metals markets. You see, we had all months and single month combined limits in the energy and metals markets for a number of decades, and I think they were removed, Mr. Sherrod will remind me in the history, around 2001 in the energy markets, but I can't remember in the metals markets. These limits would be set using a formula that is consistent with the practice the CFTC has used for setting position limits for decades. But again, we seek public comment on that. Consistent with congressional direction, the rule would also allow for bona fide hedge exemption for agricultural and exempt commodities, metals, and energies. Also following congressional direction, there is a narrower exemption for swap dealers. You see, there were some exemptions through no action letters that started about 22 years ago, where swap dealers were using a risk management exemption to do that which many agricultural interests, farmers and ranchers and the like, had done for decades, to sort of be exempt from position limits, not so much because they had positions in their inventory or they were growing the corn or wheat or merchandising, but that they came to this Commission and used a risk management exemption. Congress had a lot of debate on this. I believe the statute is quite clear that we were to narrow such exemption, and this proposal today narrows such exemptions with regard to swap dealers while still allowing them to facilitate the bona fide hedging of their customers through what I've come to call the pass-through provision. Today's proposed position limit rule builds on over 4 years of significant public input. In fact, as I said earlier, this is the 9th public meeting during my tenure as chairman to consider position limits. There is no other matter that this Commission has met on more times in the public than on position limits. In fact, it's probably gotten more in private meetings as well. We've held 3 public meetings on the issue in the summer of 2009, got a great deal of input from the markets at that point in time. We benefited subsequently to 8,200 comments we received on the January 2010 proposed rulemaking to reestablish position limits in the energy markets. We further benefited in March of 2010 from meetings publicly held about the metals markets. And then Dodd-Frank was passed, and given that new law, given Congress's mandate, we actually, pulled that initial proposal. And then we put out a new proposal in January 2011 that I think was done through 2 public meetings in December of 2010 and January of 11. And then we got 15,100 comments there. To say the public is interested in these matters would be, I think, an accurate statement. Before we hear from staff on the rulemaking that we consider today, I'll recognize my fellow commissioners for their opening statements. Commissioner Chilton.
Thanks. For a couple of reasons, this is a pretty significant day for me. I'm reminded of this great, some of you may recall, the old Etta James song, At Last. So there's 2 reasons it's significant for me. One is that at last we've got this rule here. This has been the signal rule for my entire time. I came in 2007. This issue started in 2008. And the second reason it's fairly noteworthy for me is that this is going to be my last Dodd-Frank meeting. I wrote to the president early this morning and said I'll be leaving in the not too distant future. And I waited until today, until this meeting, for this rule proposal, so we could kick it out. And even though the policy process won't be completely done after this, it's nearing an end. And so today, at last, I'm pleased to say I'll be saying "Vaya con Dios," my comrades. And I'm really excited about what I'll be doing in the future and enthusiastic. With that, I do want to give a little bit of history that dovetails a little bit with what the chairman said, but is a little different. None of my colleagues were here back in 2008 when we started this. Some of the staff were, but it was a peculiar time. We saw a bear go down, and then we saw all this money coming, the money I call massive passive money, but we saw all this money coming into markets and prices going up, like in crude, without much change in supply and demand. And I went to some of the people, some that aren't here, by the way, now, so I'm not talking about anybody, certainly at this table, and I said, what is the impact of this speculation is having? And I was told, there is no impact. That was wrong. There's been lots of studies. People can argue with the studies, but there's lots of studies out there that show that there is an impact. So I urge the Commission to use our existing authority to implement limits, but I was the only one that thought that was a good idea. And then I worked with the Hill. There was a bill. Commissioner Weejan's former boss offered a bill on speculation, Leader Reid. It was defeated on a cloture vote. Commissioner O'Malley's boss was there and talked about this issue, defeated on cloture. And then later, in the fall, and our Legislative Affairs Director, John Riley, will remember this because he was working for Chairman Peterson at the time, the House actually passed the bill under speculation, on speculation, and then they had enough votes under suspension, and then the votes were turned around, and there weren't enough votes, and then you brought it up two months later at the close of the session, and you actually passed the speculative position limits rule. And thank you, John, for your work on that. So then we had Dodd-Frank. I'll pick up where the chairman started. We had all these meetings. I supported trying to do this under the time frame that Congress mandated, which was January of 2011. That wasn't possible for a variety of reasons, but that's what I thought we should do. I won't reiterate what the chairman said about the process, but here we are, finally, at last, today, and we're going to take it to the limits one more time. Last thing I wanted to say is I wanted to thank everybody at the table here and all the other staff who's worked on this, because it has been a jaunty journey of ours on this rule, and I'm really proud of what we've come up with here today. I think that it can't be this rule, if we pass it, cannot be successfully challenged in court. I think it'll be good for markets. It'll be good for consumers. And then I do want to thank my staff and somebody that may be here but isn't with the agency anymore, Salman Benai, who led the position limits team back in the day when we did it the first time. He's gone off to greener pastures, but we thank Salman for his expertise and tireless work. I also thank Nancy Doyle, and then most of all, I want to thank Elizabeth Ritter, Professor Elizabeth Ritter, Emeritus of Georgetown, who's actually started with me. She helped me through the confirmation process. And during that time when I was being told by staff, nothing to see here, speculators don't impact, she kept saying, keep asking, keep asking. And I did. There is not, and I've said this many times, I don't believe there is a more talented, ethical, thought-worthy derivatives lawyer in the world. And the commission is phenomenally lucky to have her, and I am uber phenomenally lucky to have her working with me for the past several years. So thank you, Elizabeth, for that. All right. At last, we can move on. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Chilton, I hope I can do this before I turn to you, Commissioner Amaya. It has been a remarkable journey. You are a true public servant, and at every step of the way, these last 4+ years of service together, I think you've had the interest of the public and the markets and the investors, and yes, all the farmers and ranchers and producers and merchants that we protect these markets for, whether it's on customer protection, position limits, all the swaps market reforms, the futures markets enhancements, enforcement matters that you've held this agency to a high standard. And so I thank you. I just still want to try to go at you a little bit longer about whether this is your last meeting, but we'll continue those conversations in private. Commissioner Amaya.
Well, this is quite a day. I'm throwing out my speech, and I'd like to honor Commissioner Chilton for all his work. The first time we met was, I think, at our confirmation hearing on the time we didn't get through. I showed up shaking like a leaf, very prepared remarks, stayed on script. Bart shows up with a highlighter and I think a back of a pizza box in which he wrote his remarks, and he just laid it down. And I was sitting there saying, I'm dead, not gonna make it. Well, the truth is we didn't make it that round, but we did make it the next round. I've really enjoyed working with probably one of the smoothest, confident, capable commissioners we've had here. Somebody I agree with in many regards, and someone who I respectfully disagree with in other regards. So I am proud to have served with you and worked with you on many of these issues. And I look forward to seeing what you do in the future. I'm sure we'll have opportunities to work together, and I very much look forward to that. And I look forward to completing this rule as well. Similar rule, different legal strategy. We'll see about if we've done our homework on this one. But in doing our homework, I think there's something that we can all rely on and all agree on, and I want to work very hard on this, and that's the data. We don't have the excuse of saying we don't know what these markets are. We're receiving data daily from everybody in the markets, and we can rely on that data, or we should be able to rely on it. I know we can't do it today. There are a couple of footnotes that are troubling in this rule that I think we need to focus on, and that's making sure we do set rules with reliable data that support them. I may be outvoted on this one. I get it. But at the same time, I want to make sure that the rules we put in place are going to be effective, useful, and achieve the goals we anticipate, whatever they are. And we may disagree on what we anticipate out of these rules, but we cannot make it up anymore. We don't have the luxury of making it up, and we don't have the excuse of being able to make it up because we don't have the data. We do have the data. We need to get the data right, and we need to put it to work. So that's all I'm going to say. I have something I'll submit for the record, but this is about, in my belief, about Commissioner Chilton and his service, not only here at the Commission but in the Senate, in the agriculture department as well, a long role of public service, and you should be extremely proud of that. And I'm proud to work with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Valley. I think there's going to be a lot of bipartisanship, maybe not on the
vote.
Yeah, maybe not on the vote, but it's always bipartisanship, even when we don't get your vote, by the way. Commissioner Weegan.
Yeah, once again, following Commissioner O'Malley, I have to, I find myself wanting to echo a lot of the things that he has said, and I'm feeling compelled to do that here again today. I'm not sure it makes any sense to read the prepared statement at this point, so maybe I'll just keep that for the record. That'll appear on the website, and people can take a look at it. But I'm surprised by the news and disappointed to know that you're going to be leaving at some point soon, it sounds like. And I guess the one thing I want to commend you for, Commissioner Chilton, is you always have kept your eye on the ball, and you've always had the small investor, the consumer, the proverbial little guy in mind. It seems to be in your crosshairs all the time, helping you pursue what it is you pursue and the issues that you focus on. It seems to be all with the interests of those folks in mind. That's the one thing that has made a real impression on me since I've served on the commission now for only 2 years. And it's been a pleasure working with you. It's been a pleasure being reminded of that. That in so many ways, that's really what this is about. It's about markets. It's about efficient markets, ones that permit price discovery and all these other fancy things we say. But at the end of the day, it's also about people in those markets, people in them, or people affected by them in some way. And there's just no doubt in my mind that is always what's driving you. I don't always agree with the way you go about it, or even the policy objectives, but I never have had any doubts that the motives were pure, and it's been a real interesting learning experience for you, for me, watching you do that and undertake your duties as a commissioner in the way you have. So I really appreciate that. I respect that a lot, and wish you all the best.
I don't know if the staff really is, going to do as well, but I think before we turn to the staff, I did want to note for the public that we had noticed one other proposed rulemaking related to membership in a registered futures association, and I can't remember if it was yesterday or 2 days ago now, it might have been Friday, that we all signed that unanimously in seriatim, and so that's moving along to the Federal Register, and I just want to note that's occurred. And just as I normally do, I seek unanimous consent just for the staff to be able to make any technical edits to these two documents before they go to the Federal Register. Without objection. Again, Bart, this just is not going to be the same without you. It's just not going to be for the public who got the benefit of your authorship of Ponzimonium. It's not going to be the same for the public that has seen you just tirelessly on the speaking circuit and on television looking out for those investors and market participants. It's not going to be the same for anybody in the staff who you look out for every day, fighting for budget resources or just fighting for sort of the right thing. And it certainly is not going to be it's not going to be as much fun, by the way, for the commissioners. So, in any event, Steve Sherrod. I want to thank Steve Sherrod. You've been at the table every time, all 9 meetings, I think. But if you tell me it wasn't, I do apologize. But Steve Sherrod, who's been the team lead on this all along, also from the Division of Market Oversight, our new director, Vince McGonigal, Reva Spear Andrians, and David Pepper is from the Division of Market Oversight. From the Office of Chief Economist, but soon the Division of Market Oversight, Hannah Robb has worked on this for a number of years and now is getting moved over to the Division of Market Oversight. Jonathan Marcus, our General Counsel, Leanne Duffy. There's probably 10 or 15 other people sitting in here that may come to the table at one point or another if called. Steve.
Well, good morning. Staff is presenting for the Commission's approval proposed amendments to position limit regulations. As you mentioned, the staff at the table worked on it along with a whole lot of other staff, including Don Heitman, who's now retired. So a lot of staff have worked on this. Staff presenting today will be Jonathan Marcus to discuss the legal mandate, Leanne Duffy to discuss in an abundance of caution a necessity finding, and then I'll provide a summary of the proposed regulations. Jonathan?
Thank you, Steve. The draft proposal contains a legal analysis which concludes that the Dodd-Frank amendments to Section 4A require position limits on futures options and swaps for physical commodities. In the 2011 position limits rule, the Commission determined that Section 4A, on its face, clearly sets forth that mandate. Industry groups challenged that interpretation in ISDA and SIFMA versus CFTC. Those groups asserted that, contrary to the CFTC's interpretation, Section 4A contains a clear requirement that the Commission make contract-by-contract necessity findings before imposing a limit in a specific market. The District Court rejected both interpretations. Instead, the Court held that Section 4A is ambiguous on this point. It vacated the rule and remanded it to the Commission to resolve the perceived ambiguity. This proposal resolves the ambiguity that the District Court identified. The proposal starts with the key provision that the Court found ambiguous, Dodd-Frank Section 4A.A.2. This provision says that the Commission, quote, shall establish limits on agricultural and exempt commodities, quote, in accordance with the standards set forth in Section 4A.A.1. It was this reference to standards that the Court found to be ambiguous. According to the Court, standards could refer to the language in Section 4A.A.1 authorizing the Commission to impose position limits if it finds them necessary to prevent the burdens of excessive speculation. Or it could refer only to the criteria in Section 4A.A.1 for the characteristics of the limits the Commission sets. For example, how positions are to be aggregated to avoid circumvention of the limits, and how the levels of the limits can be flexibly set depending on the contract, delivery month, and so on. The proposal resolves the perceived ambiguity based on a number of factors and concludes that the term standards is most reasonably interpreted to refer to the criteria for setting particular limits. Those factors include the Commission's own experience with position limits, the language and structure of Section 4A as a whole, and its legislative history, in particular the events that led to the amendments made in Dodd-Frank. First, the Commission's experience. For 45 years after the passage of the CEA in 1936, the Commission's predecessor agency made findings of necessity in its rulemakings establishing position limits for particular commodities. This seriatim approach to position limits generally followed Congress's conferral of jurisdiction to the agency over particular enumerated commodities. In those early rulemakings from the 1930s to the 1950s, it took many months for the agency to conduct hearings and make a finding of necessity with respect to just one commodity. Dodd-Frank requires the Commission to have completed the process of establishing position limits for entire broad categories of commodities within 180 days for exempt commodities and 270 days for agricultural commodities. Within that short time frame, the Commission would be able to consider and make case-by-case necessity findings for at most a handful of commodities. In staff's view, to infer such a case-by-case necessity finding against that backdrop of Commission experience would be inconsistent with the 180 to 270-day time limits prescribed in Dodd-Frank. For this reason, it is unlikely that Congress could have intended the Commission to do so within that time frame. Additional Commission experience informs its determination that the standards referred to in Section 4A.A.2 do not include an antecedent necessity determination. In 1981, in significant part in response to the speculative conduct of the Hunt brothers in the silver markets, the Commission adopted its first major prophylactic position limits rule following the establishment of the CFTC 7 years before. Significantly, when the CFTC was established, Congress greatly expanded the CFTC's jurisdiction and authority to combat excessive speculation by enacting a catch-all definition of commodity, including, quote, all other goods and articles and all services, rights, and interests. Consistent with that much broader authority, the 1981 rule, then CFTC Rule 1.61, required exchanges to set position limits for all futures contracts for which there were not already limits. In the accompanying rule release, the Commission explained that speculative position limits are a beneficial tool in any market to prevent manipulation of prices and to prevent large or abrupt price movements attributable to extraordinarily large speculative positions, even in the absence of manipulative intent. Like the Dodd-Frank Act, the 1981 rule release stated that such limits, quote, shall be established according to what the Commission termed, quote, the standards for establishing limits. As used in the 1981 rule, standards meant the criteria for determining how the globally required limits would be set, including an aggregation standard to prevent circumvention and a flexibility standard to permit different levels for different contracts or different months and certain exemptions. Standards did not include the antecedent judgment of whether to have limits in the first place. That is because the Commission had already made that antecedent judgment. It said that, quote, speculative limits are appropriate for all contract markets, irrespective of the characteristics of the underlying market. Based on that judgment, the Commission directed the exchanges to set limits within 90 days in accordance with the standards set out in Rule 1.61, which included the aggregation and flexibility standards of Section 4A, A1, but did not include any determination of necessity. Dodd-Frank uses the same term, standards, and in substantial respects hews closely to the Commission's 1981 rule. Like the 1981 rule, Section 4AA2 says that the Commission this time, quote, shall impose limits according to the, quote, standards in Section 4AA1. Given the regulatory history described above, an important component of the Commission's expertise, it is most reasonable to interpret standards consistently with the 1981 rule to mean the characteristics of the limits that must be set. After all, the 1981 rulemaking is the last time the Commission definitively addressed and identified the standards in Section 4AA1 for imposing across-the-board prophylactic position limits. Also underscoring this relationship between the 1981 rule and Dodd-Frank, both laws establish tight deadlines for establishing the limits and a good faith exception for positions acquired prior to the effective date of the required limits. This good faith language entered the Dodd-Frank process in a bill numbered H.R. 977, which Dodd-Frank ultimately incorporated virtually verbatim. The committee report accompanying H.R. 977 described the legislation as, quote, mandating the CFTC to set speculative position limits. The section-by-section analysis stated that the legislation, quote, requires the CFTC to set appropriate position limits for all physical commodities other than excluded commodities. Again, this reflects the same omnibus prophylactic approach the Commission took in 1981. Given that historical context, the most reasonable interpretation is that Congress in 2010 intended the same prophylactic approach to establishing mandatory limits for physical commodity derivatives. The legislative history leading up to the Dodd-Frank amendments to the position limit statute further supports the conclusion that Congress intended the Commission to apply the same standards the Commission required the exchanges to apply in 1981. In the years preceding enactment, Congress conducted several in-depth investigations and produced voluminous reports which concluded that excessive speculation accounted for significant volatility and price increases across energy and agricultural physical commodity markets. This excessive speculation occurred during a time when, consistent with the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, position limits on certain futures contracts had been replaced by position accountability, and limits on swap contracts were the exception. In 2008, Congress gave the Commission authority to impose position limits on swaps that serve a significant price discovery function. After further investigations and findings respecting excessive speculation, Congress, in the Dodd-Frank amendments to the position limit statute, acted against the backdrop of those investigations and in light of those findings when it directed the CFTC to establish the, quote, required limits. It is highly unlikely that Congress intended the CFTC to duplicate those investigations to assess whether to impose limits on excessive speculation. Instead, it is more reasonable to conclude that Congress reached that judgment on its own and directed the Commission to impose limits on derivatives for physical commodities. This interpretation is further supported by the evolution of the position limits provisions during Congress's consideration of Dodd-Frank. The provisions were progressively strengthened as the bill evolved. The legislation first introduced in the House provided the Commission with discretionary authority to issue certain position limits. It stated that the Commission may impose them. But by the time it passed the House, that language reflecting a permissive approach was discarded in favor of mandatory language, with the bill stating repeatedly that the Commission, quote, shall impose limits. After reflecting also reflecting the evolution from discretionary to mandatory, the House along the way added two new subsections: the tight time deadlines described above, within which the Commission was required to act, and a study provision, which requires the Commission to study the position limits it imposes and produce a report to Congress within 1 year on their effects. It also requires the House Committee on Agriculture to conduct a hearing on the report within 30 days of receipt. We find it telling that the deadlines and study provisions, along with the first reference in the bill to the limits being, quote, required, all were added at the same time the permissive may formulation was changed to the mandatory shall. Later, the Conference Committee adopted these provisions of the House bill and added 3 more references to the position limits as, quote, required. This interpretation also has the virtue of giving meaningful content to what Congress did in 2010 by adding 6 subsections to Section 4A. Most relevant here, certain of those subsections, 4A.A.2 and 4A.A.5, direct the Commission to set limits on physical commodity futures and options and economically equivalent swaps within tight deadlines. When interpreting what those new subsections mean, it is important to remember that Section 4A.A.1 already authorizes the Commission to establish limits as it finds necessary on futures, options, and swaps. In light of that broad authorization, the new subsections must go further. It has been argued that the mandate in Section 4A.A.2 only mandates that the Commission impose limits when it finds them necessary. But that makes little sense, because the agency in all cases would impose limits it found necessary without extra direction from Congress. There is no history of the agency finding a limit necessary and then declining to impose one, and there's no reference in the legislative history to that sort of phenomenon. Arguments have also been made that the phrase, quote, as appropriate, which appears in the provisions the proposal construes as a mandate, requires the Commission to first determine that having a position limit is appropriate. The Court found this language to create ambiguity as to whether limits were in fact required or whether the as appropriate phrase was a delegation to the Commission to set limits at appropriate levels. The proposal addresses the ambiguity and concludes that, quote, that as appropriate refers to discretion on limit levels, not on whether or not to have position limits. If the Commission must first determine whether imposing a position limit is appropriate, then the Commission's responsibility is not meaningfully different than it would be without the subsections added by Dodd-Frank. Thus, to give any real practical effect to the sections added by Dodd-Frank, neither the reference to standards nor to as appropriate can incorporate an antecedent necessity finding. On the other hand, the opposite is not true. That is, the direction in Section 4A.A.1 to the Commission to impose limits when it finds them necessary still has a meaningful role to play under the proposed interpretation. That is because the Dodd-Frank mandate applies only to agricultural and exempt commodities, a subset of the contracts within the scope of Section 4A.A.1, which covers all derivatives. Thus, the authorization in Section 4A.A.1 to the Commission to impose limits as it finds necessary still applies to excluded commodities. Further, as I have mentioned, Dodd-Frank instructs the Commission to impose the required limits quickly, within 180 days for exempt commodities and 270 days for agricultural commodities. In context, it is not the most reasonable interpretation to conclude that the limits were discretionary. If they were discretionary, the deadlines would be a non sequitur, and Congress would not have repeatedly referred to the limits as required. Finally, Dodd-Frank requires the Commission to conduct a retrospective study, and the language of that provision presupposes that there will be limits to study. The instruction is to study the, quote, effects, if any, of the position limits imposed. The proposal notes that retrospective study requirements like this one go hand in hand with mandated action, not discretionary action. In sum, the proposal before you complies with the district court's remand order by bringing the Commission's experience and expertise to bear on resolving the ambiguity the district court perceived in the statute. The proposal concludes, based on all the sources discussed above, that Congress decided that position limits were necessary for physical commodities. Based on that judgment, Congress required the Commission to impose them expeditiously in accordance with the standards in Section 4AA1 that the Commission had previously identified for establishing across-the-board prophylactic limits. I now turn to Leanne Duffy for a summary of the necessity finding, which we recommend out of an abundance of caution. Thank you.
As Jonathan explained, the proposal concludes that the Commodity Exchange Act mandates the imposition of speculative position limits. Because of this mandate, the Commission need not make a finding that speculative position limits are necessary to diminish, eliminate, or prevent excessive speculation, causing sudden or unreasonable fluctuations or unwarranted changes in the prices of commodities. Nonetheless, in the light of the District Court's decision, and without prejudice to any argument the Commission may advance in any forum, the proposal contains a preliminary finding that such limits are necessary to achieve their statutory purposes as a separate and independent basis for the proposed rule. Historically, speculative position limits have been one of the tools used by the Commission to prevent, among other things, manipulation of prices. Limits do so by restricting the size of positions held by non-commercial entities that do not have hedging needs in the underlying physical markets. By capping the size of speculative positions, limits lessen the likelihood that a trader can obtain a large enough position to potentially manipulate prices, engage in corners or squeezes, or other forms of price manipulation. The position limits in this proposal are necessary as a prophylactic measure to lessen the likelihood that a trader will accumulate excessively large speculative positions that can result in corners, squeezes, or other forms of manipulation that cause unwarranted or unreasonable price fluctuations. The preamble of the proposal states that in the Commission's experience, position limits are also necessary as a prophylactic measure because excessively large speculative positions may cause sudden or unreasonable price fluctuations, even if not accompanied by manipulative conduct. Two examples that inform the Commission's determinations are the silver crisis of 1979 to 80 involving the Hunt brothers and events in the natural gas markets in 2006. In Section 4AA1 of the Act, Congress identifies sudden or unreasonable fluctuations or unwarranted changes in the price of such commodity as an indication that excessive speculation may be present in a market for a commodity. The rapid rise and sharp decline in the price of silver that commenced in August 1979 and was spent by the end of March 1980 certainly fits the description advanced by Congress. Nevertheless, the Commission in this proposal expresses the belief that, based on its experience and expertise, the burdens on interstate commerce are not limited solely to the temporary and unwarranted changes in price, such as those exhibited during the silver price spike that resulted, at least in part, from the deliberate behavior of the Hunt brothers and their cohorts. Indirect burdens on interstate commerce may arise as a result of unwarranted changes in price, such as occurred in the silver price spike of 1979 to 80. Such burdens arise due to manipulation or attempted manipulation, or they may result from the excessive size and disorderly trading of a speculative, that is, non-hedging position. The Commission reiterates the belief expressed in prior rulemakings that if federal speculative position limits had been in effect that correspond to the limits that the Commission will propose now across markets now subject to Commission jurisdiction, such limits would have prevented the Hunt brothers and their cohorts from accumulating such large futures positions. The proposal would also find that speculative position limits would help to diminish or prevent unreasonable fluctuations or unwarranted changes in the price of a commodity, such as the extreme price volatility in the 2006 natural gas markets. The preamble describes how the findings of the staff of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the United States Senate about the 2006 natural gas markets support the imposition of speculative position limits outside the spot month. Based on assumptions described in the preamble, the proposal expresses the belief that if Commission-set speculative position limits had been in effect that correspond to the limits that the Commission will propose across markets now subject to Commission jurisdiction, one market participant would not have been able to build such large futures positions in futures and swaps and thereby would have restricted its ability to cause harmful price effects that limits are intended to prevent. The proposal also states that position limits would prevent the accumulation of extraordinarily large positions that could potentially cause unreasonable price fluctuations, even in the absence of manipulative conduct. The text of Section 4AA1 of the Act itself establishes its broader purpose. It authorizes limits to prevent price distortions that can potentially occur due to excessive speculation, that is, excessively large speculative positions, without regard to whether it is manipulative. The Commission has long interpreted the provision as authorizing limits to achieve this broader purpose, and it has long found that limits are necessary to do so. The preamble recites instances of such findings.
Thanks, Leanne. In addition to the staff at the table that the chairman recognized, I know we had a number of economists who worked on drafting this proposal or analysis that's included in the proposal. And I'd like to just mention them briefly. From the Division of Market Oversight includes Steve Benton, Lee Ken Chu, Ken Danger, Krista Lockenmeyer, Lynn Riggs, and Martin Murray. And from the Office of Chief Economist, in addition to Hannah, we had Stephen Kane, Scott Mixon, David Ripon, and some others. Right? And so today I'll provide a summary of the scope of the draft proposed federal limits, then a summary of the basic components of the federal limits and associated reporting rules, and finally a summary of the proposed requirements and guidance for designated contract markets and certain swap execution facilities. The scope of the proposed regulations cover 28 core physical commodity futures contracts and their economically equivalent futures, options, and swaps. Collectively, these are called reference contracts. Those 28 core physical commodity futures contracts include 9 futures contracts currently subject to federal position limits and 19 additional futures contracts. To select the 28 contracts, physical commodity derivative contracts were sorted based on the largest notional value of open interest, and open interest by the broad commodity groupings of agriculture, energy, and metals. The top 16 agricultural commodities, 4 energy commodities, and 5 medical commodities were selected. And once these commodities were selected, the leading futures contracts in a particular commodity, generally futures contracts with the highest levels of open interest, those were deemed the core reference futures contracts. So there are 19 in the agricultural commodities, 4 in energy, and 5 in metals. Staff's recommending a phased approach to comply with the congressional mandate, initially selecting these 28 core futures contracts rather than all physical commodities. In subsequent releases, the Commission would propose to expand the list of core reference futures contracts to include all physical commodities, subject to the authority that Congress provided under Section 4AA7 of the Act to exempt, among other things, a class or contract of commodity derivative contracts. A phased approach will reduce the potential administrative burden by not immediately imposing position limits on all commodity derivative contracts and physical commodities at once. And it may facilitate adoption of monitoring policies, procedures, and systems by persons not currently subject to limits, such as traders and swaps that are not significant price discovery contracts, which may not be subject to any limits currently. By way of example of the administrative burden, Commission staff has identified 464 separate commodity derivative contracts that would be reference contracts under the proposal. Now turning to the basic components, there are three basic components to the current position limit regulations. One is the level of the position limits, two, the exemptions, and three, the aggregation standards. This proposal would amend the first two components, and the third component regarding aggregation of positions is the subject of a separate staff recommendation. Regarding the first component, the proposal would establish levels of limits for each spot month, each single month, and for all months combined, consistent with current federal limits and Commodity Exchange Act Section 4AA3. Spot month limit levels will be set generally at no level than 25%, no greater than 25% of estimated deliverable supply. The spot month is not a calendar month, and rather under the proposal, and consistent with the current exchange practices, it's a period of time, generally the earlier or the last 3 days of trading, or the time period that begins when a short position holder can give notice of intent to deliver prior to the close of trading. These spot month limits would be applied separately to physical delivery reference contracts and cash-settled reference contracts in the same commodity. The proposed initial spot month levels would be based on the current levels at exchanges listing the core reference futures contracts. Alternatively, the proposal would permit the Commission to establish higher initial spot month levels based on estimates of deliverable supply submitted by the CME Group, if those estimates are verified by the Commission, or such lower level that an exchange listing the core reference futures contract may recommend. Subsequent levels would be adjusted no less frequently than every 2 years. These subsequent levels would be set at no higher than 25% of the Commission's estimate of deliverable supply, developed in consultation with the DCMs. Non-spot month position limits, that is, limits applied to positions in a single contract month or all months combined, would be set using what we call the 10-2.5% formula. That is 10% of the first 25,000 contracts of average open interest for a calendar year and 2.5% of the average open interest over 25,000 contracts. The initial levels of non-spot month limits would be based on open interest in futures and options traded on DCMs, as well as swaps that are significant price discovery contracts. Swaps and futures options would be included in that open interest on a futures equivalent basis. Subsequent levels would be adjusted no less frequently than every 2 years based on reference contract open interest for a calendar year. Open interest used in determining subsequent non-spot month position limits would be the sum of futures open interest reported under Part 16 and swaps open interest as reported either to the Commission under Part 20 or to a swaps data repository. The second component, exemptions from position limits, would provide 5 categories of exemptions for, number 1, positions that are bona fide hedging positions, 2, financial distress positions, 3, conditional spot month limit positions, 4, other positions as the Commission may exempt under Commodity Exchange Act Section 4AA7, and 5, exemptions for positions that are established in good faith prior to the effective date of the initial limits established by the regulations. The Commission's associated reporting rules in Parts 17 and 19 would also be amended to collect information related to the new exemptions. The proposal would amend the existing definition of bona fide hedging for positions in physical commodities to conform to the requirements in the Dodd-Frank Act. Proposed new enumerated bona fide hedging exemptions would include unfilled anticipated requirements for resale by a utility, royalties, and service contracts. In addition to the amendments to the 2 components of the federal position limit regulations and amendments to the associated reporting rules, staff also recommends requirements and acceptable practices for DCMs and swap execution facilities that are trading facilities for setting position limits for the 28 reference contracts, as well as position limits or accountability rules in all other listed contracts, including contracts in excluded commodities. In general, DCMs and CEFs would be required to use the Commission's bona fide hedging definition for physical commodity derivatives and to use the Commission's aggregation standards for all position limits. The amended definition of bona fide hedging for excluded commodities would incorporate provisions of 2 1987 interpretive statements, continuing to provide flexibilities for DCMs and CEFs to grant risk management exemptions in excluded commodities. And that concludes my summary. The staff would be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Steve. I think I first will entertain a motion on position limits. I think Commissioner Chilton might want to make that motion.
I move the proposed rule.
Second from Commissioner Amaya. I thank you. I feel I've asked a lot of questions in the 8 prior meetings that we've had this. But I do want to focus on one thing, which is the really remarkable work in here that staff has done. I presume, Hannah, you've had a lot of involvement in this, and of course everybody from the Division of Market Oversight on the review of 130 studies. And there's a list in the appendices of these 130 studies, and then a review on page after page after page summarizing these studies. Before I turn to the question, I really do encourage the public to dig into these studies, to give this commission advice, comments, counsel with regard to these studies. They're at the heart of cost-benefit analyses, but there are also cost-benefit considerations, to use the technically precise term. But they're also a bit of the heart of this necessity finding. And so I turn to page 56 for those of you who have the document. And I'm glad that there's a statement in here after summarizing the studies. And of these 130 studies, there are studies that are suggestive that speculation in markets and excessive speculation do have burdens on interstate commerce and burdens that are on the markets. And there are other studies that suggest otherwise. It's a mixed reading of the studies. There are studies that say that position limits have a positive effect, and there are other studies that say they can't find any such positive effects. I remember, I think, amongst the studies, two separate parts of the Federal Reserve System, one study out of St. Louis Federal Reserve and one study out of Chicago, I think come out on different sides of this. Is that right, Hannah, roughly speaking, or Steve? Do you want to, just for the record?
That's right.
All right. So two different parts of the Federal Reserve, I think, even have different places in this study. But there's an appendix that has the 130 studies and over about a dozen pages in this rule. But particularly I'm looking at that it says, in any case, these studies overall show a lack of consensus regarding the impact of speculation on commodity markets and the effectiveness of position limits. So we have 130 studies. We have some that say speculation affects the markets, some that say maybe it doesn't, some that says position limits work, some that maybe say it doesn't. Could you just give a little summary of that, and then I'm going to speak to how I, as one commissioner, take this all in.
Absolutely. In these 130 studies that we and myself and my colleagues have reviewed, about 50 of them were actually submitted during the last round of position limits rulemakings. So we do know that market participants and the public are also reading these. And we decided to be even more expansive than they were the last go-around. What we ended up finding was that while some of these studies show, or some of them look at speculation in particular, some of them show that there may be a relationship between the amount of speculation in a market and price movements or price volatility. Other studies find no such connection. Still more studies are inconclusive as to whether or not there is such an impact. Overall, very few of these studies have any real input onto position limits in particular, whether or not they should be implemented, how they should be implemented, that sort of thing, making them largely inconclusive when it comes to their impact on our policy here today. So the lack of consensus is consistent throughout all of them, as strange as that sounds. We've got about a third of them that say excessive speculation has an impact, about a third that say it doesn't, and about a third that says they can't tell.
So if I can pause there, Jonathan, when I look at this, I look at a third that say it does have an effect, a third that maybe says it doesn't, and a third that's, as Hannah said, doesn't maybe address it. I'd call that, to the American public, sort of a classic jump ball. if I can use the expression. Is that all right, Jonathan? I'm going to ask you a legal question in a second, but do you understand what I mean by that?
Yes.
So I think of this, Congress, in light of Congress's clear intent, though a district court judge said, all right, go back and within your realm of rulemaking, make some determinations, findings, necessity, and so forth. I find that if a third of the studies say this does have an effect and maybe a third says it doesn't, that jump ball, that it's better to err on the side of caution. That using my judgment as a commissioner, it's better because there are dire consequences if the third of the studies that say there is an effect were somehow ignored by this commission, particularly in light of Congress's intent. And so I'd like to know from you, is that framing appropriate?
Well, I would just first say that, with respect to the district court, the district court did not require us to do necessity findings. The district court identified an ambiguity in the statute as to whether we had a mandate to impose limits without such findings. And as you know, the proposal undertakes the analysis that the district court asked us to do by bringing our experience and expertise to bear. And we, of course, we've concluded based on that analysis that Congress did in fact intend to require the Commission to impose position limits without such studies and findings. And if that is the case, of course, studies that talk about whether excessive speculation exists or whether it's a problem would not be pertinent to the mandate that we have to follow from Congress. Of course, we have to take our instructions from Congress and following Congress's instructions. But if you assume that there is no such mandate and the Commission does have to undertake the traditional, undertake its own discretionary determination whether position limits are needed, then I think you get into the framework of the necessity findings and the studies that have looked at this. And I agree. I think that, but you still get guidance from the fact that Congress in 4AA1 has said that excessive speculation in 4AA1, Congress itself has made a finding that excessive speculation does cause unwarranted price fluctuations. And Congress also indicated through 4AA1 that position limits are an effective tool. So I think those have to weigh heavily on the scale when you're interpreting studies that go kind of in both directions. And so I do agree that in light of the fact that Congress gave the Commission this prophylactic authority to protect the markets from excessive speculation that Congress believed does have harmful effects, that does exist and can have harmful effects, it is appropriate to look at all these studies and err on the side of caution in implementing a prophylactic regime.
For me, I thank you for that answer. For me, I think the position limits help promote the integrity of the markets. No one speculative position, no one party has an outside influence that might influence price discovery when times are good, or influence price discovery or even the risk of a clearinghouse when times are bad, and that position needs to be unwound or liquidated. But I also look to the studies, and I see this demonstrable lack of consensus, and I think as a prophylactic matter, it's better to err on the side of caution than to kind of ignore the at least one-third that say there could be a real problem here. And I think it would be not only inconsistent with Congress, but in a sense then, ignoring a vast body of work that suggests that there could be problems here.
I agree. I think that is the right way to frame the concerns and how to address them.
All right. So I don't know if it would be a technical edit or not, but on this one paragraph, I might have like 5 or 6 words just to try to frame or something. But I'm going to turn to Commissioner Chilton. That's my only question.
Thanks again for all your work. Jonathan and Leanne, you did a great job on this. Thank you. I go to a lot of places, but I'm just going to stick right now on studies for a little bit. Hannah, because I'm not 100% sure on this this Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. I know there's a Federal Reserve Bank, and I don't want to get into debating studies, as you'll see, but I want to make sure I get something correct. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, I know, linked speculation and prices. I'm not aware of a Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago that said there was no link. Are you?
I'm not recalling it at the moment.
Okay.
Again, after 130 studies,
Yeah,
it might
that's
just
fine.
not be
Yeah,
at the top of my head.
The only government report that government study I'm aware of is this Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, which showed a link between speculation and prices. Okay, and just so to prove that I'm not going to debate all these studies, I'll just look for some quick, Hannah, I'm asking you yes and no answers if you can. Are you aware of any study that looks at supply and demand and links in 2008 when consumers were paying $4.11 per gallon for gas, the highest still today that they've ever paid, and crude oil reached $147.27, summer 2008. Are you aware of any study that proves that supply and demand caused those prices?
There are studies that certainly argue that.
Did supply and demand cause it to go to $150?
There are studies that think that there are supply and demand factors that cause that jump. There are studies that believe that supply and demand factors.
I'd like to see those. I've been asking everybody in speeches for, 3 years.
I will say I don't believe it's been proven. Nobody has conclusively said that is the only way it could be.
Supply and demand was going like this. Supply and demand was about even. Crude oil went from $90 to nearly $150 and then back down to the 30s. And supply and demand was moving a little bit. The supply and demand was fairly static. The prices were anything but. So it's hard for me. Okay. Are you aware of any study that links, that detaches speculation from prices that wasn't funded by the industry?
What do you mean detaches?
That says that there's no relation between excessive speculation and prices. Is there any study you're aware of that wasn't funded by the industry, either through a researcher that was funded through the industry or by an industry group? Newsflash, industry group says industry not to blame for prices. Is there any study you're aware of that dismisses the link to speculation to prices that isn't funded by the industry?
I can't answer that question. I'm not sure who is funding whom.
Okay. Now, I've looked at a lot of them. And then lastly, part of the problem in all of these studies, and this happens all the time in government, is that the question that people want to say is whether or not speculators, they want it to be black and white, whether or not speculators drove prices. Can you pin it all on them? And that's not the question we should be asking. If consumers are paying 10 cents more a gallon of gasoline, because in part excessive speculation has contributed to prices, that's a concern for this agency. We're not just concerned about did they cause all of it. We're the consumer's advocate. That's what we're supposed to do. I'll defer anything for later, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Commissioner May.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Chilton.
Mr. Sherrod, footnote 426. I'll just read it. It's on on the version I have. I don't know if it's the same version you have right now. It says, quote, several reporting entities have submitted data that contains stark errors. For example, certain reporting entities submitted position sizes that the Commission determined to be 1,000 times or even 10,000 times too large. Can you explain what the nature of our data shortcomings are and what this footnote relates to? Well, it says, the footnote relates to a sentence in the document that says the Commission is considering using Part 20 data, our large trader data, right? Should it determine such data to be reliable in order to establish higher initial levels in a final rule, and then it says the data is wholly unreliable. Can you explain the challenges we're facing with the data and what we are using to base these position limits on?
Sure. As part of Dodd-Frank, the Commission received authority over swaps and promulgated a new rule, Part 20, to require certain entities to report swaps positions in physical commodities that were enumerated in Part 20. It includes the 28 commodities that are the subject of this proposal. The first reporting entities are essentially clearing members of derivative clearing organizations. Those clearing members were to take their physical commodity swaps, convert them to futures equivalents under guidance that provided by Commission staff, and report them on a daily basis. They gained experience with that reporting process, and the error rates with our Office of Data Technology, working with the reporting firms, they seemed to be doing better, and by January of 2013, we had what we thought to be a reasonably improved. It was certainly much better than the early reporting under Part 20. In a second phase, the reporting entities were expanded to include swap dealers and major swap participants. And as those reporting entities that were not clearing members of derivative clearing organizations started reporting, that's some of the errors that are referred to in this footnote. More recently, and not in the text of this preamble, and I mean more recently in the last few weeks, a major reporting firm has again, in some way changed their process, most likely, and introduced stark errors into their process, reporting futures equivalents on the order of 2.5 billion contracts in a particular commodity. It's just off by, clearly an order of magnitude of swaps that they have outstanding. Now, it's dependent upon the reporting entities to give us accurate data. It's their obligation under Part 20, but it is a complex undertaking, and our staff at the Commission have been working with those firms to try to improve that data. Our hope is that the data quality will continue to improve, and that we would be able, in a final rule, to be able to rely upon that information.
So what is the data that we're using to inform us about the precise limits, and whether now that we're experts, as Mr. Marcus points out in our legal strategy, what is our expert opinion and what is the expert data we are applying to set these limits?
Right. By way of background to frame the reference for this discussion, on page 182 in Table 12, we provide you a summary of the Part 20 data, the average daily open interest for January 2013. And in general, it shows that for a number of these commodities, there aren't a lot of open positions in swaps that are being reported by these reporting entities. There are a significant amount reported, the largest in swaps linked to NYMEX natural gas, where there's about 1,060,000 futures equivalents reported. Those are reported in the category of uncleared swaps. So what the staff is recommending is that we use the data that we've consistently been receiving since the Commission received authority under the 2008 Farm Bill, and those would be the data we have for futures and options every day in the large trade reporting system, and the data we receive on swaps on significant price discovery contracts under the Part 36 authority that was passed after the Farm Bill.
Congress gave us a kind of a difficult challenge in setting these specific limits. I think is the category reference. It says, there are 4 factors: diminish excessive speculation, deter manipulation, at the same time ensure liquidity for hedging and price discovery. How are these limits walking that narrow line to ensure that we diminish the excessive speculative concerns and obviously enhance hedging and price discovery?
So staff over the decades has consistently recommended position limits that are at the outer bounds, high levels, because of particularly concerns about not interfering with price discovery function of the market. Speculators certainly are in the mix of traders and contribute to that. Speculators also may provide adequate liquidity for bona fide hedgers in the marketplace, and so staff again recommends using the traditional formulas that set limits at kind of the outer bounds on the high side. The other objectives, diminishing, for example, diminishing the potential for manipulation, corners or squeezes, or the harm in excessive speculation causing, the excessive price volatility that could lead to those negative externalities. Those are things that staff have weighed, and in light of where we recommend the limit levels, very large. So, for example, the existing limit level that we're also recommending to be retained for wheat on the Chicago Board of Trade, it's 600 contracts. That's 3 million bushels of wheat. It's 180 million pounds of wheat. That's in the spot month. In the current individual month, single month limit is 20 times that large. These are enormous quantities. Just for the benefit of those that kind of can't weigh the contents, it's like the spot month limit is 4,000 semi-trucks full of wheat. And the single month limit is 20 times that large. So these are certainly erring on the high side, and we think there should be adequate liquidity for the bona fide hedgers, and the price discovery process will continue. It doesn't mean that the limits would prevent all manipulation or all price distortions. The continuing obligation will be on traders not to manipulate the market. By staying under the position limit, it's not a defense against the manipulation.
Let me move to hedging. Last year, following in the final rule, we had a petition by the working group that enumerated 10 specific hedge exemptions that they were seeking. This year, or this proposal, we've only included 5 of the 10. Why is that?
In section, I think it's 4AC2. Did I get that right? Did I get it wrong? No, I think that's right. I think that's right. Congress directed the Commission to adopt the definition of bona fide hedging. That definition is largely based on the existing 1.3Z1, but it varies in a few key words. And so staff worked with the Commercial Energy Working Group. We've been back and forth with them numerous times to try to get real examples of the risks and not hypothetical examples, and where we could identify examples where they had real price risk, a real value that's a value change in an asset liability or some sort of service that they're providing, or when we could see those, then we've drafted in additional enumerated bona fide hedges to provide those additional exemptions into this proposal, right?
There's still a petition process the same as it was in the previous rule?
The petition process is basically statutory. It's self-effectuating. The draft regulation basically points to the statutory authority under 4A7.
In the previous proposal, we had a reasonable certainty standard allowing for an exemption in the case of offsetting transaction where there is one is to complete and the other is a reasonably certain to be completed. We have taken that out of this draft. Why is that?
My recollection is we used the two words reasonable certainty, and only the examples in an appendix that were trying to be illustrative of bona fide hedges. So that reasonable certainty was never explained as a policy position or a recommended procedure. We were trying, by way of example in appendices, to explain why someone who follows the prior and the current regulation guidance in, for example, Regulation 1.48, who is an anticipatory producer or has unfilled anticipated requirements, why they would be reasonably certain, and they would give us evidence of that by saying, for the last 3 years, here's what I produced, or here's what I've used in my production manufacturing process, and here is my expectation for the coming year. And that was a way of shortcutting that regulatory requirement by way of an example, but to my knowledge, it didn't appear in the preamble or any of the regulatory texts in the vacated Part 151.
Did we remove the reasonable certainty because we removed anticipatory hedging for merchandising?
The vacated Part 151 rule did provide, it was not in the notice, but it was in the final, it did provide a hedging exemption for unfilled storage capacity. We very carefully reviewed the statutory requirements, and we're asking questions rather than providing that proposal in the regulatory text. At this time, we're unable to see a price change in an unfilled storage bin that would be in any way reasonably related to a calendar month spread in one of any of a number of commodities that might be stored in that unfilled storage facility. And so we've asked questions in this preamble trying to solicit, hard, concrete examples of the pricing relationships that would be consistent with the statutory requirement.
We've included trade options as part of the position limit rule. Yet we didn't include a question whether they should be included or not. We've just assumed they should be included. This is an issue that end users are struggling with to define. That 7-part test, Part 7 is very difficult for them to meet. Would you have any objection, or maybe I should ask the Commission, would the Commission have any objection to adding a question whether or not we should include trade options as part of this rule or not, as part of the consideration of position limits, and how we would do so under the 7-part test?
I'm guessing you're still not going to vote for the rule. What was that?
I asked the first question. We can get to the second question later.
Oh,
Mr. Chairman. Okay.
I just thought I'd have a little fun with you, Scott. I didn't know. I assume that you're not voting for it. But assuming you're not voting for it, I still don't have an objection to adding questions to a proposal. It's seeking public comment. But
I'll just add, I explored this issue with the staff too, and as I understood it, it's difficult to do it in this document, although I would like to have the question included, only because it's a different rule set that determines whether or not the trade option should be included in position limits or not. I forget the exact rule number, but if it's appropriate to include it here, I would certainly support it.
And just let me, on this, trade options, if I remember, under the 7-part test and so forth, are swaps because Congress says options are swaps in the statute. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so then, I guess really the question would be, if you want to set it up properly to allow the Commission an opportunity under the Administrative Procedures Act, it's sort of, is there this form of a swap called trade options, should that be excluded or exempted somehow? I think that's what you're looking for.
Well, I think that everybody's struggling with, is it a forward or is it a trade option? And then if it is a trade option, I understand. If it is a swap, then I understand why you might include it. But I think people are trying to understand how they're going to separate this from a forward or not.
So is your, because I'm trying to work with you to include a question, is your question that if it's a forward, is it included? Or?
I would like to just make sure that we work through this and we can kind of make sure that this question is asked. And I think there are a couple of ways we can look at it and ask a couple, maybe possibly a couple of questions around it. But I think there's enough uncertainty around it. I think we'd want to frame it, maybe both looking at it both ways. If it is a trade option, how should it count? If it's not, then
right. But if it's a forward, it's out anyway.
Well, that's always the problem. Is it a forward or not?
And I don't think, as Commissioner Wiegand said, I don't think this rulemaking will answer that. But I think you're asking an additional question, which I would be supportive of. Even if it is a trade option, do we ask some questions about would it be appropriate to
and when
exempt
do we
them.
count it? And when do we count it? I mean, if people are still trying to figure it out and we have the optionality in the contract, do you count it at the beginning where you're still uncertain as a swap or not?
And if we ask the question here, perhaps it has to be answered in a place other than the finalization of this rule, but it probably would be valuable to get it out there and get comment.
Steve, do you think you have enough there to write a question?
I think I do. I mean, we've talked with a number of commissioners and your assistants about those that may in the industry want to include trade options because they're delta hedging with futures and then they would automatically net down outside of the spot month. So that there are some that may wish to include trade options, and there are others who may be holding inventory and writing trade options against that inventory, and then they would be kind of required to file a bona fide hedging exemption. And if trade options were out, they would be off the hook from filing that bona fide hedging exemption.
So I think the nature of the question is to the extent that something is a trade option, you would note forwards are out anyway. We should affirmatively make sure people understand that. But to the extent something may be a trade option under the current rules and regulation of the Commission, should we exempt either by any characteristic, participant or other characteristic, some trade options, then you'd have to raise a second question, I think, because you're saying some people would want to count them in and some people might want to count them out, and whether we'd even have that authority, but you could ask some questions about that.
Right. So
right?
we can certainly draft that as a kind of 4A7 exemptive authority that could be perhaps discretionarily used by a person and claim the exemption for trade
So
options.
what I'm suggesting is following on this.
Ask the question.
Ask the questions, but do it enough in a way that under the Administrative Procedure Act, you leave flexibility that in the final rulemaking, the Commission could figure that out. They can't answer the question about forwards versus trade options, which is really another docket.
Right.
No. I don't know how I'm going to do that, but maybe if I can ask for unanimous consent to allow Steve to draft those two questions that we just talked about. Absent objection. Okay.
Thank you very much. So,
Thank you. And I do want to just pause, if I could, before I go to Commissioner Weegan. I do think we've made tremendous progress. It's been transformative in this swaps market reform. There's now about $400 trillion of data in the data repositories, of which just under $2 trillion is in these physical commodity swaps. I think the figures that were estimated recently, Scott and Hannah, were about 1.7 or 1.8 trillion notional. But there's a lot of work to do. Scott Amalia is absolutely right, and the staff is absolutely right in the footnotes. We're still getting a lot of data in under Part 20 and under Part 45. Part 20 is the large data swaps reporting reform. Part 45 is the swaps, just overall data repository reform. We're still getting a lot of data in that's not standardized enough. Frankly, it's not compliant with our rules. And though this Commission and its staff have been looking at it, we're resource constrained. John Rogers, the head of our Data and Technology Office, has been working. You've been working, Commissioner Amalia, through your Tech Advisory Committee to try to bring highlight on this. I mean, at some point in time, this Commission will have to determine whether we actually use our enforcement authority. That hasn't been appropriate to date, but, just to really ensure that the data is coming in a consistent way and a usable way for federal regulators. So I think I just want to ask, we've left the flexibility that if by the time we finalize there's some better standardization in the data, we could shift from the method of data that you have in there to the full use of Part 20. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you've left that flexibility in the final rules.
Yes.
Okay. Commissioner Weegan.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up on one of the questions Commissioner O'Malley asked concerning the process for seeking other hedges outside of the enumerated hedges identified here. But before I get to that, I just want to thank you, Steve, and the rest of the team for accommodating some of these questions around, for now anyway, staff rulings on some specified enumerated hedges and whether they would be permitted as such. And I think while the staff has taken a view on that, it's going to be helpful, I think, to get some more comments and understand better whether or not that's the appropriate treatment of those hedges. But as far as going forward and the process laid out in this rule, I have some concerns about it. The chairman just alluded to the fact that the commission remains resource constrained, and we've all experienced in the last 2+ years now that once a rule has become finalized, it's inevitable that a number of questions come in from the market participants, and I would expect that we would likely see that here too at the point in time when this rulemaking is finalized and decisions are made about which enumerated hedges are permitted and which ones aren't. But if we get that decision wrong in the final, I think it would be very valuable for the Commission to retain as much flexibility as we can in permitting additional appropriate non-enumerated hedges. And so the fact that, as I understand it, the process and the rule lays out something that's basically an exemptive process that requires notice and comment, I worry some that might be that might not have the flexibility and the timeliness that perhaps the marketplace deserves. And if we're most interested in liquidity and price formation in these markets, I wonder if a rigid, less flexible process could stand in the way of that. So I want to make those comments and point out that with your assistance, Steve, we were able to get some questions in the release today that asked for additional comment on that as well. So I look forward to hearing what the comment letters say on that score. The other issue I wanted to ask about or talk a little bit about is daily reporting. We've talked now about Part 20 and Part 45. Is there any other specific daily reporting requirement in this proposed rule before us today? You and I talked about this, Steve, in the last couple of days.
The bona fide hedge exemptions would follow the existing reporting format. And so by way of example, with Form 204, someone relying upon a bona fide hedging exemption would file as of the last Friday of the month their positions in cash inventory and fixed price purchase, fixed price sales that are forward contracts. Each of those persons, though, already have an obligation to the extent they're reportable traders to keep complete books and records, so the Commission staff is able to look at those for any particular day where they're reportable, and the reportable levels are much lower. This varies from the requirement that would have required someone to report, for example, their cash inventories on a daily basis on each day. And I think it's consistent with the current practice where if someone reasonably can rely upon their inventory as a basis of their bona fide hedge, and they haven't sold that inventory, there's kind of no pressing need that I can see to recount it every single day.
But isn't there, under Part 19 of today's release, I believe there is a daily reporting requirement for those that have exceeded the conditional spot month limit, isn't that right?
That's right. And the conditional spot month limit exemption would allow, it's the way the release is structured, there's a baseline proposal in the regulatory text that would allow a trader that's only in cash settled contracts to have an exemption to be 5 times larger than the spot month limit if they stay out of the physical delivery contract. When they relied upon that exemption for a commodity identified by the Commission as a special reporting category, and the initial one would only be natural gas, then by every day, the next day at 9 a.m. the next morning, they would have to report to the Commission their cash market inventory and their forward purchases and sales in the delivery location for the particular Henry Hub natural gas contract. There are some alternatives to that proposal that are drafted in as questions. Those alternatives would include limiting this sort of conditional spot month limit exemption to a cash settled contract, for example, that cash settles only to an index of cash market transaction prices and not to the physical delivery core reference futures contract. So there are a variety of different alternatives, and we've recommended the Commission seek comment on those different alternatives.
So it's at least possible that the burden of daily reporting under Part 19 could be diminished even further depending on how the rest of the proposal is changed at the final rule stage. Correct?
That's correct. And historically, as Leanne mentioned, there has been a lot of volatility in natural gas trading. And so the Commission staff has recommended for that particular commodity that if the 0.5, as we style it, the no position in the physical delivery and 5 times in the cash settled contract, if that is approved in a final rule, then we recommend that daily reporting of the cash market transactions and inventory in natural gas.
Does Table 11 provide that outside of the energy contracts, does it provide that there would be any reporters that would have to undertake this daily reporting obligation under Part 19 based on what we know today and reflected in Table 11?
No, it does not. The only one we recommend is natural gas. As we gain experience, if the rules go into place and we see volatility in trading, perhaps we see aggressive trading in the cash markets pursuant to special calls, then we would come back to the Commission and recommend expanding the scope of that reporting.
Thank you, Steve. That's all I have.
I just wanted to take a moment to come back. I misspoke. There were 130 studies listed, but it was actually the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, October 2011. It wasn't so much a study. It was a note that they put out, and it probably fell in that third bucket, which was inconclusive, but nonetheless, maybe we list that Dallas Fed note from October 2011. I also just, I'm going to try out some words. They're not anything different than I said before, but on that page 56, and maybe I'll ask unanimous consent, but just while there's not a consensus referencing the studies, while there's not a consensus, the fact that these studies are on both sides, in the Commission view, warrants erring on the side of caution. I mean, that's how I was trying to articulate it. So, absent objection, I would just sort of try to add that on page 56.
Mr. Chairman, before given the opportunity to make statements, I mentioned that I was going to just have for the record what I had prepared today, but since you mentioned this issue about the underpinnings for the mandate, I just want to point out to the public, I spent a considerable amount of time talking to our litigation team and our advisors on this very issue, and so there's a considerable discussion of that in the statement. But I appreciate you talking about that some here today. And looking forward to additional comments on that during the comment period.
Yeah. And I think, though I didn't necessarily agree with the district court judge, Judge Wilkins, I think what we have here in front of us is a very well researched and buttoned down and proposed rule, but it also leaves a great deal of flexibility because it highlights, as you were highlighting in the cash settled area, cash settled spot, a series of questions. We just added some questions on trade options, but we have a series of questions that really say the Commission is open to considering alternatives, whether it's on cash settled spot month limit with regard to trade options, but then in a host of other areas really with regard to this. So I think whether it will be 8,000 or 15,000 comments this time around, there will be thousands of comments that come in based on this. So, Melissa.
This is a vote on the notice of proposed rulemaking for position limits for derivatives. Commissioner Weejan.
Aye.
Commissioner Weejan, aye. Commissioner O'Malia?
No.
Commissioner O'Malia, no. Commissioner Chilton?
Oh, yeah.
Commissioner Chilton, aye. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye. Mr. Chairman, on this matter, the ayes have 3, the noes have 1.
Bart, do you want to take the chair for 30 seconds to do the usual stuff I do right now to react to that vote count?
Oh, yeah. With that, it is approved. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And we'll send it to the Federal Register. With that, there's a second roll. It's this, by and large, the same people at the table. If you could give a brief summary on the aggregation proposals. Do I see some people exchanging seats? Maybe Mark Pfeiffer is coming up from the General Counsel's office. And you can feel free to keep this brief. I think that this is well understood by the Commission.
Yeah, we'll go quickly. Good morning.
That was a hint.
Staff is presenting for the Commission's approval proposed amendments to the current account aggregation standards. These amendments are substantially similar to the aggregation modifications that the Commission proposed in May 2012, but were not finalized before Part 151 was vacated. The amendments presented today would permit 4 additional exemptions from aggregation, where first, the sharing of information that goes along with aggregation would violate or create a reasonable risk of violating federal, state, or foreign law or regulation. Second, where there's an ownership interest of no more than 50% in an entity whose trading is independently controlled. Third, where there's an ownership interest of more than 50% in an entity that is not consolidated and whose trading is independently controlled, and the applicant certifies that the positions either qualify as bona fide hedging or do not exceed 20% of any position limit. And fourth, where there's an ownership interest of no more than 50% in an entity by a broker-dealer resulting from its normal course activities. We're suggesting these 4 aggregation amendments separately from the other amendments to the position limit regime in order to allow the Commission, in its discretion after reviewing the comments, to adopt these modifications separately. Although these aggregation amendments are consistent with the other position limit amendments, they could be adopted either together or separately. I'll just briefly go through the history of the aggregation rules and the changes that were proposed last year. The Commodity Exchange Act requires aggregation of all positions in which a person owns or controls and all positions of persons acting pursuant to an express or implied agreement or understanding. The Commission's current regulations include a requirement that a person aggregate all positions for which it has a 10% or greater ownership interest. Regulations also provide exemptions for eligible entities with independent account controllers. When the position limit regime in Part 151 was adopted, exemptions were added for information sharing that would cause a violation of federal law or regulations and for an underwriter's ownership of an unsold allotment of securities. As I said, in May 2012, the Commission proposed changes to the aggregation rule that remain part of what we're proposing today. The first change proposed in May 2012 would allow a person to disaggregate the positions of a separately organized entity, even if it had a 10% or greater ownership interest, but so long as it had no more than a 50% ownership interest, and if the person filed a notice demonstrating lack of control. Another change that was proposed would make the information sharing exemption available where there is a reasonable risk of violating, or an actual violation, of federal, state, or foreign law. Other changes proposed in May 2012 would allow higher tier entities to rely upon exemption notices. They provided an exemption in certain circumstances for broker-dealers, and they allowed commodity pools established as limited liability companies to be treated the same as limited liability partnerships. Staff considered the public comments on the May 2012 proposal in developing the amendments suggested today. We've retained the essence of the earlier proposal with the addition of the following elements based on those comments and the staff's further consideration. Today's proposal includes a provision that would permit the owner of more than 50% of another entity to apply to the Commission for relief from aggregation on a case-by-case basis. This reflects a view that in some limited situations, disaggregation relief may be appropriate even for majority owners if the owned entity is not required to be and is not consolidated on the financial statement of the owner, if the owner can demonstrate that it does not control the trading of the owned entity, and if both the owner and the owned entity have procedures in place that are reasonably effective to prevent coordinated trading. Additionally, the owner must certify that either all the owned entity's positions qualify as bona fide hedging, or the owned entity's non-hedging positions do not exceed 20% of any position limit. This proposed relief would not be automatic, but would be available only if the Commission finds in its discretion that all the conditions are met. The proposed rule would not impose any time limits on the Commission's process for making the determination of whether relief is appropriate, and relief would be available only if and when the Commission acts on a particular request. We note that if a majority owner could not meet all the conditions in the proposed rule, it could apply to the Commission for relief from aggregation under Section 4AA7 of the Commodity Exchange Act. Lastly, today's proposal also includes an amendment that would allow managers of employee benefit plans to be treated as independent account controllers, and we'd like to emphasize that this proposed relief would be limited to employee benefit plans. Regarding broker-dealers, this proposal includes an exemption for ownership of no more than 50% of an entity resulting from dealer activities in the normal course. And finally, we note that in connection with these proposed amendments, the staff reviewed the wording of the existing regulations and noted certain instances where they may be unclear. Therefore, the amendments put forward today include a reorganization of the rule for clarity that is not intended to affect any substantive change. We invite commenters to address whether this reorganization is accurate and helpful. And as is the case for all proposed rules, the staff welcomes comment on all aspects of the proposed changes to the aggregation rules for the position limits regime. We're available to answer any questions.
Entertain a motion to accept the staff recommendation on aggregation for purposes of position limits.
So moved.
I support this proposed rule to modify the aggregation provisions for limits on speculative positions, and I'll have a statement for the record, but just trying to put it in the simplest terms. Market participants in this day and age often trade through many legal entities, sometimes hundreds, in fact, thousands of legal entities. I've noted a few times when Lehman Brothers failed, they had 3,300 legal entities within their corporate family. And so the question comes up in so many of our rules and so many of our efforts. If there's a requirement on one part of a corporate family, how does that relate to the rest of the corporate family? And here, where Congress has mandated for us to move forward on limiting certain participants in the market in terms of the size of their position, then you can quickly see it's just a matter of arithmetic. The question comes, do you count all those 3,300 legal entities that Lehman Brothers once controlled, or do you apply a limit just for each and every one of the 3,300? Now, we chose the second, that you had a limit on each of the one out of 3,300, and yet they were owned and controlled by the same people. That would sort of be, excuse the expression, but a runaround of congressional intent, and also wouldn't really help the market integrity that we're trying to help. So that's where this issue of aggregation comes into being. We have similar issues of aggregation throughout our rule writing, but that's why it comes right here where there's a limit. I think that when we finalized the rules that were subsequently vacated by the court, we had some more work to do, and in May of 2012, before any judge vacated the rules, we as a commission, I think it was unanimous actually at the time, decided to put out to further comment new approaches and reforms on aggregation. And I felt those were very balanced. Really, what if, I'll use the Lehman Brothers example, what if Lehman Brothers only owed 10% of some company and they didn't really direct its trading, they didn't control its trading, they maybe owned it in what's called the private equity investing, which was allowed then. Should that come into this aggregation and so forth? And I'm fortunate we got 26 public comment letters. It was not measured in the thousands, but 26 public comment letters, and we made some additional modifications, and that's what is embodied here. I do think, though, it's important that we don't loosen these things up so much that all of a sudden Lehman Brothers 3,300 companies could have all been separate. I do think this basic tenet that there has to be aggregation under position limits is critical if these regimes have any meaning. So I don't have any questions, but I'm going to turn it to Commissioner Chilton. Commissioner. Aye. Wow. Melissa, may you call the vote?
This is a vote on the notice of proposed rulemaking for aggregation of accounts under Part 150 position limits. Commissioner Weejan.
Aye.
Commissioner Weejan, aye. Commissioner O'Malia.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Malia, aye. Commissioner Chilton.
Aye.
Commissioner Chilton, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye. Mr. Chairman, on this matter, the ayes have 4, the noes have 0.
The vote being unanimous, the staff recommendation is approved and will be sent to the Federal Register for public comment. Are there other matters? Commissioner Amalia.
Could you help us understand the time frame for the cross-border discussion and how we're going to do the determinations, include input from the relevant jurisdictions, have the time to review all of that, review the MOUs of supervisory MOUs, and make a determination by December 21st when we have yet to see any paper on this, aside from the 88-page comparison of their rules and our rules, but they have not had the opportunity to review. My understanding, they're reviewing that, but we haven't received their response.
We will make this work before December 21st. We've had very good dialogues and discussions with each of the 6 jurisdictions. They have asked us to share with them, as we have, our what I would call side-by-sides on various entity-level requirements for swap dealers reporting, swap dealer business management, or is it called risk management, chief compliance officer, and the like. We're starting to get feedback. I think the conclusion of that feedback will be this Friday, if I recall. But, we set some tight deadlines. Those documents are also in all the commissioners' hands to the extent you have input from those side-by-sides. Frank Vucenich in the Division of Swap and Intermediate Oversight, and, of course, Sarah Josephson and our head of our international effort, Carlene Kim from the General Counsel's Office, are all working on the documentation for commission determinations. On some of the data side, Vince, I guess Stewart, if I remember.
That's correct.
You might say for the record Stewart's last name, I'm sorry.
Armstrong.
Stuart Armstrong, if people want to contact him, are working on that as well. Based on that feedback from the various international regulatory regimes in these 6 jurisdictions, the staff will turn around and get into each of the commissioners' hands documents later this month. But I encourage input, feedback on the side-by-sides that have already occurred, and feedback to any one of the staff would be very helpful with this regard. So.
And Volker's still on track, 1,000 pages. We haven't seen.
I can always rely that we have a very open and lively commission meeting. I recommend it, by the way, to any other regulatory commissions, because this is a good part of democracy. Where we... Yes?
I'm sure they would take your advice, Gary.
Yeah.
Certain of it.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you thought it was a good part of democracy. On the Volcker rule, this is one of the most challenging rules. We as a commission, I think, have finalized for Dodd-Frank 65 or 66 rules and guidances. I think, from my own perspective, this is one of the most challenging, because banning proprietary trading, that which Congress decided to do to lower the risk to the American public of bank entities failing, while at the same time permitting market making to help the markets work, permitting hedging, underwriting, and so forth. It's a matter of sort of borders and boundaries and where they overlap. And I'll just use one example. Market making is permitted. Somebody walks in with a position, 1 million shares of IBM stock, and needs to sell it, that would be a large position. You could buy that. But at the same time, proprietary trading is banned. So how long can somebody hold that position, a banking entity, until it's really a proprietary position? I think probably everybody would agree if you held it for 5 years and it was unhedged, that's gone from market making on day one, and sometime it's become a proprietary position that even starts to grow some mold on it at some point. And having worked at an investment bank for 18 years in my case, there were some positions that really did move from a market-making desk and just stay for a long time. And in the derivative space, this is even more interesting because many of the customized, uncleared swaps will stay on the balance sheets of large banking enterprises for years, maybe up to 30 years. And so as they stay there, how do they hedge them? And it would be appropriate to hedge them. I've just sort of recognized some of the challenges. There's been some very good work. The document is moving along. We don't have, as an agency, a finalized document. If we were to schedule a vote the second or third week of December, I've indicated to all of my fellow regulators that we stand pretty strong that it's got to be pens down version to all of this commission 3 weeks before, but preferably a lot before that. But we're no longer in the lot before that, because that really only gives us about 2 weeks to get a pens down version to all of you and get your feedback and input and so forth. But that's where we are.
Well, we do, the words are going to matter, and with all due respect to your example, we want to see all the words. We don't want to,
I agree with you. In fact, I think the words matter so much here. Commissioner O'Malley and I will agree on this. The words matter so much here. You could write the words where the Volcker Rule would have very consistent meaning to what Congress intended. You can write the words that the market making, for instance, if you could continually market make and add to your positions over years and never sell them, then you, in essence, have no Volcker Rule. So the words very much matter.
Well, we just need them in time. And considering the workload that we have with substitute compliance, and these are as complex a subjects as any that we've contemplated. So we just need plenty of time to get these things done. I'm not trying to delay. I just don't want to be caught in a position that we can't reasonably get through 1,000 or 2,000 pages of documentation.
I share your view about the challenges of this one. Commissioner Chilton.
I just want to make a quick comment on this. Here's a problem. Volcker said that you couldn't do proprietary hedging. I wrote to Chairman Bernanke a year ago, September. I wrote to him again, and to other regulators. I wrote to him again in September of this year, August of this year. And the deal is, we know something about hedging. There's a lot in the Volcker Rule that we're not the expert regulator. On hedging, we're the expert regulator, and we should, all of us, figure out what that language is. Because what the bank holding companies and others will do is they will try to say that their hedge is a speculative, or they'll try to say their speculative position is a hedge. That will happen unless we have this language tight. So of all the things that may be in the Volcker Rule, to me, that's the one where we need our advice to ensure that we're being true to the law. Thanks.
Sure, Commissioner Weegan. All right. Again, before we adjourn, I want to thank Commissioner Chilton. I know this has been a remarkable journey, not just on position limits, but on everything you've done to look out for the public, to look out for the investor with your eye on the ball of reform. You've been also, if I can say, a remarkable partner I remember the first time that we chatted during the presidential transition. You gave me some advice on actually my confirmation that at that stage I needed all the advice I could get. And I really do appreciate on that advice all the way through advice you gave me this morning. I want to thank you. With that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second? Thank you.